evening and welcome to our meeting for the Board of Commissioners on August 2, 2021. Some may be asking, why are we meeting on Monday? We are required by statute to have a meeting every month. And in August, we have the month off so that we meet in the first Monday type deal. But we're just a little bit less than that. And on our agenda this evening, we do have a Finance Committee and then an actual Board of Commissioners meeting. So we will not waste any time, and we will get started with the Finance Committee and recognize its co-chair, Commissioner Zella.
Thank you, President Bernheim. There is but one item, although a very important one, on tonight's Finance Committee agenda. Our Chief Financial Officer will provide an update of the general fund forecast for 2021. I would note that we recently, as a board, received our 2020 audit, reviewed it with the auditors, and that audit is posted to the township website for anybody who would like to review it. We have lots of good news that our Chief Financial Officer is going to present to us tonight. Eric?
Sorry, I'm out of practice. It's been 18 months since we did this. So. All right, is everyone seeing this as much as possible? Try to. All right, so as Commissioner Zeloff noted, this is the time of the year where we provide the board with an update on our general fund financial forecast. So we're going to be looking at not only what's happened so far in 2021, but start to get a look at where we think we might finish the year and what that bodes forward, what that means for the township moving forward into 2022 out through 2025. So we're going to look at some trends both on the revenue and expenditure side, look at that updated forecast, and this really leads into kind of a kickoff for the board into the 2022 budget season. So when we start and look at the financial forecast update, going back to the last time we did one of these forecasts, that was November of 2020. We had an adopted budget. We had an anticipated use of for us, a significant amount of fund balance. We had a pretty bad winter from a budgetary perspective in terms of costs. We provided the board with a financial update back in May, and also had the good news in May of receiving our first half of the ARP dollars. The board just in June recently held its capital budget or capital improvement plan workshop, and as Commissioner Zeloff noted, our 2020 audit is completed. So from a really high-level summary, here's where things stand. 2020 was a really poor year financially for the township and for most local governments and for most people in general in a lot of ways. Obviously, COVID dramatically impacted our budgetary results, particularly on the revenue side. But what we've seen in 2021 so far, and we'll get into the specifics, is a real rebound, actually, in revenues. This is really being led by a substantial rise in business taxes received from certain taxpayers. What we also have seen so far in terms of expenditures is they're right around where we're budgeting. In terms of where we are right now in the forecast, I have a higher degree of confidence on the revenue number for 2021 because we received the vast majority of our revenue in the first half of the year. I have a little less degree of confidence in the expenditure number. Those expenditures are a little bit more even throughout the year. We're just right now, actually, last week and this week, going through the meat of our preliminary budget meetings with all the other departments, where we'll be fine-tuning those 2021 estimates. So generally what we've seen, and I actually look back about the last 4 years, is generally there's a decline from where we're estimating numbers for general fund expenditures in July to where we end up. Over the last 4 years, it's been as little as $100,000, as much as a little bit over $1 million. So if I was a betting man, I would bet that we'll probably end up below that budgetary number. The question will hopefully be only how far and not in the other direction. But what this adds up to is actually, instead of a year where we anticipated to significantly draw down our fund balance pretty close to our policy level, is it's actually going to looks like a surplus year. So that's very positive from the township's financial perspective. The other thing, just want to highlight that bottom line, final bullet, all these projections and everything I'm talking about tonight excludes any impact of ARP funding dollars. I thought it would be wise to kind of give the board a baseline perspective of what things look like, and that's kind of the goal here, and don't want to prejudge any of the board's deliberations and how it decides to eventually use those dollars. So when we talk about our general fund, you have to first start and talk about the real estate assessment base. Pretty close to 50% of our, historically, the township's general fund revenues come from real estate taxes. So what you see here is actually a really positive chart for the township. You see steady increases year over year in the real estate assessment base. Now, when you look here at the very bottom, if you can't see it, the final two bars, the first one says 2021, so that's where we were as of 1/1/2021. The final bar over to the right shows the 2021, and it says C, what that means is where we are currently. So that's basically as of 7/1, that's the assessment base that the school district taxes are based on. So what we've seen is an increase of just over almost $31 million versus January 1st. However, the July and August period is when we start to see all the annual assessment appeals come through. So generally, the growth that happens in the second half of the year is very much constrained by those assessment appeals. But still, so far, pretty good results. And even if you look back, if you look back at the levy from 2012 versus 2021, the growth in the assessment base equals about $1.1 million in terms of gross real estate taxes. So the positives which we have overall in terms of this forecast on the revenue side, as I mentioned, business tax revenues due to certain taxpayer performance, really positive. We do expect that a significant portion of that is one-time revenue. But if you've heard me say this one time, you've heard me say it probably every year, I'd rather have one-time revenue than no-time revenue. So that's something that's positive and something for us to manage, but we'd rather have it than not have it. The PMIC refund revenue was higher than projected. Really what happened here is what happened the fourth quarter of last year. We had a spike in COVID. A lot of doctors probably weren't seeing as many patients. A lot of elective surgeries were probably pushed out. So people weren't able to go to the doctor as much as we maybe were anticipating they were in the fourth quarter of last year, so our claims were actually much lower. So that allowed us then to have a little bit of a higher refund than we anticipated. And then as I've kind of been reporting to the board on a quarterly basis, real estate transfer taxes, if you look back 12 months, have really been very, very well performing. I think it's been pretty well documented. The real estate market, both in this area and nationally, after the very poor first half of 2020, it's really been a revenue source that has really performed very, very well. On the negative side, the pool revenues, we still have capacity constraints and kind of a different membership structure, so that's really constrained revenue there. And then interest rates, when I get offers from banks on interest rates, they just go out more and more decimal points. It seems like every couple of months. There's just so little money that we can get even just through, we're rather limited in terms of certificates of deposit and things of that nature, but you'll see the very vast downturn that we've had in that revenue stream. So when you look at the 2021 budget compared to the 2021 forecast, you look at the variances. Basically, you can throw everything out except for business taxes, and everything else is within $100,000 or so. We talked about business taxes and PMIC and real estate transfer taxes. The recreation departmental expenses, really what that is, we had a very strong rebound really beginning in the second quarter of this year in the programs. So that's your soccer programs, your whether it might be Zumba or chess or whatever those programs are, They have really rebounded very well, and people seem to have some demand for those. So that has really rebounded much better than we anticipated. Reimbursed expenses, that's something that just is very variable throughout the year. The highway aid, that's really not a problem or concern for us. The money we get, we split between the general fund here, and the rest of the money goes to support our paving program that's going to be kicking off very soon. So even if we're a little bit low here, that just means we're putting more money in, using more of those funds for our annual paving program. The investment income we spoke about, and then on parking, we've still seen a real decline overall in that. Everyone's kind of been saying what's going to happen post-Labor Day. Are more businesses going to open up? We'll just have to see what happens and see if that impacts parking, and we spoke about pool fees earlier. When you look at this compared to the 2020 actual, again, you see mostly the same story at the top of this chart here. In terms of real estate taxes, this is all categories. The reason for that increase is really when you look at both a little bit of the assessment increases. Also, we've had some court stipulations related to prior year assessments, some of which have been in our favor. So we've had prior year assessments that we've been able to collect on. And then also we did have a slight uptick, if we recall, in our lien list for 2020, which isn't surprising given the circumstances. But that usually means is then you collect a little bit more the next year in delinquent taxes. So that's what's happened there. Ordinance violations, that's really related to not issuing as many parking tickets. So you see the change there, or excuse me, in this case, in 2020 versus in 2021, having a full year of enforcement. You see the downturn in investment income. Grants and gifts, we had a $200,000 grant that we got in 2020, which was a one-time issue. However, I will note, we did just get notice last week that we are getting roughly a $100,000 reimbursement from the federal government related to some COVID-19 expenses. So that number, that $65,000 is going to be jumping up, so that's positive for us. And then the reimbursed expenses, in this instance, in 2020, we had some reimbursements related to our bonds, which were actually taxable bonds that we received a federal subsidy back for. We refunded those bonds midway through 2020, so we will not be receiving those subsidies anymore. That's fine for us because we're actually saving on the debt service, on the interest side of that, but that's the main reason for the downfall or downturn there. Just wanted to zero in real quick. You can see if these forecasts hold true, the real up and down volatility in terms of general fund revenue over the last few years and what we're looking at a little bit going forward. I mean, if I had more time, I would have done a little clip art of a roller coaster because it really looks like, not anything you'll see when you look at even our historical revenue streams. When you look at the expenditure side, personnel costs, that's going to be always, for a local government, labor intensive, that's going to be your biggest cost driver. We still have seen some staff turnover and the resulting vacancies in various departments, combined with the time it takes just in kind of this brand new world we're living in to kind of fill these positions. That does have an impact, departmentally, but it also has a benefit to us in terms of some savings in terms of personnel costs. Overtime expenses have been higher in public works and associated departments. Anyone that was involved in the January, February snowstorms, we've seen it when we're looking at their preliminary budgets. Debt service has been in line with what we've been budgeting and what should be expected. And we have realized some other cost savings in other categories, and I think as we go through this budget process, we'll continue to identify those and try to make sure we keep within budgetary allotments as much as possible. So in this preliminary forecast, again, we're just a hair over the budgeted levels. When you look at this chart, you have to remember that the salaries variance kind of plays off the bottom line, the other charges and transfers, because that's where we budget centrally the turnover, because I don't know necessarily how many people are going to be out in X number of department. So we budget that centrally, so when you compare the budget to a forecast, there is that little bit of variation. I am expecting at this point that both the salaries and probably the employee benefits numbers that you see here are probably going to drop a little bit more, just at the rate that it's been taking us to kind of find, identify, and fill open positions as we go forward. The other personnel services, that's been down because we had another year without a lot of travel and training that's been held. Contracted services and professional technical services, those have been lower year-to-date, will be revised as we go forward. On the other side, with both the materials and operating supplies, other compensation, that all really has to do with your winter storm. So your materials and operating supplies, that's all your salt, it goes in there. Your other compensation, that's your overtime. So both that and some of the extra police special duty overtime definitely has an impact on that. All that special duty overtime is always reimbursed, though. The employee benefits, one thing I'd point out here when you look at this comparison, where we actually ended 2021 in employee benefits was actually at about 11.6%. So that increase is actually basically about cut in half, that percentage increase. And one of the things that we have seen is when we do have this additional overtime, that will drive up your FICA expenses, which is covered in employee benefits as well. In terms of comparing the actual expenses in 2020 compared to 2021, at least what we're forecasting thus far, the machinery and equipment is down a lot because we had some one-time expenses in 2020 in the police area. We also had some expenses in this area, or in this room, excuse me, for the sound system, Zoom, all of those things, which kind of came out of nowhere in 2020. A lot of the other things are really as budgeted. Uniforms and clothing, we haven't bought new police uniforms in several years, or at least a full fleet of them, so we really need to do that this year. You guys awarded a contract, I believe, within the last 2 months on that issue particularly. The contracted services, again, goes back to snow. You got to, sometimes when we have these big storms, we bring in a contractor to plow out some of the parking lots. That we did not do in 2020, we did in 2021. You kind of see the impact of that. That's the largest part of that variance. Otherwise, other compensation, materials, operating supplies, employee benefits, that's the same story as I told on the previous slide, really related to snow and overtime. In terms of salaries, again, there are some salary increases across the organization in 2021, but all these numbers are going to be further refined as we go through the rest of this year. So where does this all leave us? In terms of when we look at where we are going over the next 3 to 4 years, it's always a little bit helpful to kind of look at where we've been. So the slide on the top here, the red line, I think you'll be able to see this right here. This is actually the township's millage rate. So any increase is a tax increase. So what you can see is since 2011, this has been a straight line. So again, we're at 10 years and counting in terms of keeping that millage rate. The blue bars here are the annual revenues in the general fund. So you can see, obviously, in the first 10 years or so, there's a real strong correlation between when there is an increase in the millage rate and when there is an increase in the general fund revenues. What you've seen really over the last 8 or 9 years is, even though the tax rate has been steady, is we have this nice kind of steady rise from 2014 to 2018, and then we kind of have come into this kind of volatility period. But at least where we are right now, we're ending on a high note, so that's good. The chart on the bottom shows both those revenues and then also the gross expenditures over time. And the green line shows the general fund's fund balance. That's usually one of the leading financial indicators that we talk about with rating agencies. So you can see that fund balance overall has generally been increasing when you look over the last period of time. So from a forecast perspective, the 2021 numbers is the same as what you've seen before. The 2022 numbers, again, I would caution, are very preliminary at this point. We do probably expect some variation once we get through our budget process. But overall, what this shows to me is the main takeaway is it's really promising for the board because, again, we are anticipating this number right here to be around 17 to 18% for 2021. If all holds true, we're back up into about 30, 31%. What that does is buy the board financial flexibility as we move forward into 2022. These numbers, again, assume no changes to the real estate tax millage rate throughout the forecast period and no allocation of anything related to ARP dollars. Again, we still could see significant changes overall, but the bottom line is, without a doubt, our financial position looks much improved over the last year. This gives you a look kind of 5 years forward, or 5 years back and 5 years forward. So again, the black line you can see, that's the revenue volatility that we were talking about. The red line is expenditures. So really, you look 2016 to 2020, you average that out, that's the growth has been really within the revenue, as the revenue growth has exceeded the expenditure growth overall, but that's really been positive. And, the hope is, over time, we'll have to see, but, what we try to do is try to bend this red line down a little bit more. We've been able to do that. You look back over the last 4 or 5 years, in terms of various forecasts, we've been successful in doing that. Of course, that's also something for the board to decide, as, the budget is the purview of the board in terms of where the expenditures are necessary and where they should go in future years. This chart here, the black line shows you your fund balance as a percent of expenditures. The green, yellow, red lines here show you the township's fund balance policy. So the basics are you want the black line to be above the solid horizontal green line. So you can see based on our most recent forecasts, we look to be in a pretty decent position to achieve that in 2021, obviously, and into 2022. We'll see how the next couple of months unfolds as we get towards the proposed budget, but generally, definitely much more positive than when we looked at this last July and also last November. So what does this mean and where do we go from here? Apologies, as I note, I should have said that's the 2022 budget calendar. But here's where we are. September, a little bit more than a month from now, we'll have a budget workshop with the board. And after that, we'll take that feedback. If need be, we'll come back to the board with finance committee meetings, September, October, to hash out any policy guidance that we need from the board on any particular items. And then we will go back to work scrubbing the numbers, revising the revenue and expenditure projections, and come back to the board with a proposed budget in early November. That'll kick off the public process in terms of public meetings, board comments, potential amendments, all leading up to hopefully adoption around December 15th of this year. So with that, I know that's a lot of information, but hopefully it helps the board get a feel for where we are, at least as of the about 7 months through the calendar year. I'd be happy to answer any questions that might come from the board. Thanks.
Eric, thank you very much for a very thorough and superb presentation just now. And it's excellent news for Lower Merion Township taxpayers and remarkable strength of our financial position for 2021. I have one question. Eric, do you think that given the growth in real estate values, that what you reported as typically successful or at times successful assessment appeals in the second half may occur less frequently or in lower amounts this year, given the real estate market strength?
I'm hopeful that that's the case. I had a conversation with a colleague of Solicitor High, who I work with on real estate tax assessment appeals. The common level ratio, which is basically an equation that you use to take your assessed value to your market value, that came out in early July. It was up another 5.2% or so. So basically meaning your house, if your house is assessed at, say, $200,000, it would probably be about a market value now, based on that, of about $440,000. It's even more than a 2-to-1 ratio now. So those things generally should help the township's case, and the Board of Assessment hopefully takes that into consideration when they look at all these appeals. We'll have a pretty good sense of that usually by the end of September is when a lot of those appeals come through. But I'm hopeful that that's going to be the case. I think it's impossible to ignore that the values are going up, and I think some of the people who have been successful in the past would likely be less so going forward, given the circumstances.
Thank you, Eric. Can you tell us what is the new common level ratio?
I can if someone else wants to ask a question, and I'll just look it up real quick.
Okay. Do any members of this committee have any questions or comments for our Chief Financial Officer, Commissioner Grimes?
Yeah, so thank you, Chairman Zeloff. Eric, first of all, thank you for the report, and thank you for the good news with the report. I'll give you all the credit for that. Just two questions related to Chairman Zeloff mentioned the real estate transfer tax, and we had estimated, I guess, $4,200,000, and now up to July it's 4.6. Given the rapid pace that houses are selling for record prices, I mean, or really high prices, do we still think that that's, I mean, has this been an updated figure, the 4.6?
This was updated in early July.
Okay,
so what I would say is if volume continues to be steady or grows, we're going to blow past probably 4.6, I would think. I'm not going to say exactly how high, but that's really the constraint, is how many homes might sell. I would be confident if volume rises, then our revenues are going to rise past 4.6.
Yes, thanks. And my second question, in terms of the expenditure forecast, what are we predicting for inflation in terms of inflation of our costs for things that we have to buy?
We don't have a particular, we don't use kind of like a, all right, if you don't know what this number is, increase it by 1.2% or 2.5%. There's no doubt that inflation is happening. We're seeing that in some of our areas in terms of, especially like in fleet and in parts and things of that nature. So when we meet with our departments, we are having conversations about these things are getting more expensive. This is happening. So I don't have kind of like a generalized inflation estimate. What I think we'll see, and what we can kind of report back to you, is especially when we look at kind of non-personnel costs, when we get to the proposed budget, is kind of strip out the personnel costs and then look at those non-personnel costs, basically 2020 to 2021 estimate and going forward to 2022. And I think you'll probably see a little bit more of a cost increase because of inflation in certain areas in that regard.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner Grimes. Commissioner McComb.
Thank you, Chairman Sullivan. Eric, again, I join in thank you for a terrific presentation. I would ask you just to comment a little bit. You mentioned sort of the roller coaster nature of the numbers. 19, big number, 20 obviously down, COVID, 21, a great year, but it's dropping again. So is the drop to 22, is that because 21 is catching up from what happened in 20, or is it more complicated than that?
It remains to be seen to a certain extent. You know, if you look at this revenue roller coaster, what it really tells the story of is business taxes in the township. And those can swing in a great direction one year to the other. So 2019 was actually probably our banner year in business taxes, I think, especially in excluding any one-time revenues, at least for the last 10 years. Those dropped precipitously in 2020. They've rebounded in 2021. We don't at this point anticipate all of that to recur, but we will have a chance also when we get closer to October, we'll see more in terms of extension payments and any refund requests and things of that nature. So we'll have more data when we come back to you in November. I wouldn't be very much a betting man on this topic, right, but I would have a more informed judgment and kind of an answer to give you than I do right now. You know, I think in terms of certain things, and going back to what Commissioner Grimes was asked about, in terms of real estate transfer tax, that has the potential, interest rates stay low, the housing market stays positive, to be something that could help us even more again next year. You know, pool revenue, that could be $300,000 more next year if we have a normal pool season. So there are some potential outside of the business taxes, even if they drop a little bit, some things that could buffer us. If people start going back to the office more and people buy more parking permits, then that could increase. So, but as the last 18, 19 months has shown us, things can go sideways too. So, we'll have to kind of, hold on to the bar on the roller coaster and, keep
We're not
your
gonna flip it up
hands
and
in
go
feet.
like
Yeah,
this.
yeah. You might get car sick if you do that, or
right.
roller coaster sick.
Great,
But,
thanks, Eric.
just to answer briefly Commissioner Zeloff's point, let's stop the share. Open up.
Will you let me know if there's any online questions? Or is it just Anna?
It's just sorry, the mouse is a little slow. This shows you for Montgomery County the common level ratio. So you can see right 7-1-21, 2.24. So that's basically if you know your house's assessed value, multiply by 2.24, that basically is the equivalent market value. So you can see precipitously since the last housing decline, so you had common level ratio declines from 2019 all the way through to 2013. And you can see how it's risen from 1.58 to 2.24, and you can particularly see a very strong growth from 16 through to 2021. It's been very steady and growing. So,
That's very helpful. Thank you, Eric. Do other members of the committee have any questions or comments for our Chief Financial Officer? Commissioner Courtney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hi, Eric. Great to see you in person. I had a question about, you mentioned we're running a surplus this year because of a one-time windfall. My recollection is we were projecting a $6.5 million deficit. Where would we be without this windfall? Ballpark.
I would say we would probably be a little bit better than budget. So we budgeted about a $7.3 million deficit. I'd probably say we'd probably be in the six-ish range.
Okay.
So it is, again, very significant to from the township's perspective.
Great. I'm recalling our debt service last year was about 15% of expenses. Is that right?
Just a little bit lower than that, maybe 13.9, 14 or so, 14.1. So just a little bit lower than that. Yes.
Would you project that would stay about the same this year?
In 2021?
Mm-hmm.
The one thing about debt service as a percentage of your general fund expenditures is, you can have a plan that, the debt service as a percentage is going to go down. But if you have a year where you don't have any snow and you don't have a lot of overtime or other expenses
Right.
just naturally decline, then it could go up. And the opposite side, if you have a year where you projected to stay steady, but you have various things like, several years ago we had the papal visit, and you had a whole bunch of overtime related to that, or any such thing, then that percentage can drop even if you didn't plan it. So we anticipate it was going to stay pretty much around that 14% level. When you consider the savings that we got from the refinancings last year, you consider the fact that our plan is not to issue any new debt in 2021. That should stay very steady, but it's also going to be a factor of where the final expenditures come in.
Okay. When you show the chart that has the three horizontal lines for and you call that our general fund policy at 10, 15, and 20, am I right in interpreting it that it is our policy that our general fund balance should be somewhere between 15 and 20% of our expenses?
Yeah, it's actually written to be a minimum of 12, but a goal of 15 to 18. But in practice, we really always try to be in that 15 to 20 range.
Do we? Is that, I've never seen us actually below that green line.
Well, I would say in policy, we try to be around that range, but just as anyone would rather have more money in the bank even than they plan, the township is that way as well. And what that's really allowed us to do, if you look back over the last 5 years, is allowed us to, A, keep tax levels the same, and B, also make, as we spoke about earlier today, transfers in a one-time basis to the capital improvement program, which have led to a decline from about $107, $108 million in debt outstanding to what looks like at the end of this year about $90 to $91 million in debt outstanding. So it's allowed the township to reduce its debt outstanding by taking some of those positive financial results we've had and issuing less debt as we move forward. So, but you are correct. If you look back, really going back to 2011 was really when we had a very large spike due to some one-time revenue. Since that period, we've had projections, and I mean, I stand by the projections that we had coming into 2021. I maybe thought we'd do a little bit better than budgeted, but I never anticipated that it would flip around this much. But no, we have not come back down to 23, 22, 21% in that period. We've been fortunate. You know, that's the strength of the township's local economy, and the residents have benefited in that from not having their taxes raised in a very long time, comparatively speaking.
I agree, it has been a very long time. And then, so in the information you sent me today, I don't know if you want to put that table up, or I can just sort of summarize. I asked Eric to send me how much, what the number of general fund transfers that we've used to contribute to the CIP over the past. And Eric gave me numbers for the last 6 years. In the last 6 years combined, we have had CIPs totaling almost $49 million. And in combined transfers from general fund and sewer fund, we only did those transfers in 2 years, and it's been $4.5 million. That means we've only used 10%, we've only covered 10% of our CIP costs over the last 6 years with money from the general fund or the sewer fund. To me, that says I'm not against taking on debt, particularly when you have a great credit rate, when you have favorable interest rates like we did last year, but we have a really large general fund balance. It's a great problem to have, but it is well in excess of our stated policy, and our general fund as a percent of expenditures over the last 6 years, except for last year where it was about 29%, has been well over 30%. And so I guess I'm kind of curious why we would choose debt financing and not be more actively transferring general fund balance to cover CIP, or increase the size of our CIP, increase the level of investment that we have in the infrastructure of our township, given that we're sitting on these big piles of cash.
Well, that's certainly a policy choice that you guys can consider and can vote on. I'm happy to do whatever policy the board seeks to implement. From a perspective of what you're talking about, you know, one thing I would say is we're not planning to issue new debt at all this year. The other thing, not to get into too much public finance speak, but the concept behind issuing debt isn't only based upon the great credit rating the township has, but also on this concept of what's called intergenerational equity. And that's the idea is that when you make long-term capital improvements, like we made to our library system, like we make to our parks that are going to last decades, hopefully, is by issuing debt, taxpayers over the life of those improvements who benefit them pay the cost of them back through debt service, rather than if you were to say, okay, we're going to do a one-time tax increase, or we're going to shift a large amount of dollars from the general fund to the capital projects fund in 1 year, then the argument is that the taxpayers currently are more bearing the burden of those current improvements. So it's a little bit of a public finance, gets maybe a little bit in the wonky territory and things of that nature, but there's two sides of that coin. And, you know, we are in a very strong financial position again. So if the board wants to consider some sort of transfer, that's certainly something the township could consider. Now, the right amount, how much, yes or no, those are all issues that we can discuss at length, and it's really ultimately up to you all to make those policy choices and guidance. As to the size of the CIP, I wasn't at the CIP workshop, but, you know, that CIP can be as large as you want it to be or as small as you want it to be, also just taking into account the capacity the township staff has and the contractors have to deliver it. So, you know, that's something that's really borne out as we go through the budget process. So those are all policy decisions that you all get to make, and then I figure out how to implement.
I think that's great. I didn't think it was too wonky. I'm excited to talk about intergenerational equity for a second.
We should probably also recognize that the $2 million or so in transfer in 1 year and 2.5 in another year to the capital improvement fund is not the only support those funds give to the capital improvement plan. Remember, the $8.8 million in debt service you're paying each year is also paying for the capital improvement plan. So where you see $2 million in 2018, well, that's on top of the 8.8 you were already paying off in debt service.
Thank you. I appreciate that clarification. I will note, though, that in the years that we ran surpluses, 2019, 2017, we did no transfers from our general fund. We just continued to accrue money in the general fund balance as opposed to investing it in our CIP. And that's what I wanted to really point out, is that I think money sitting in our general fund is the least efficient use of those dollars, when we could be investing in the township. We could be improving our infrastructure, improving the amenities. And when it comes to intergenerational equity, I like that. That's a great explanation as to why we take on debt. I think it's a good justification there. My concern is when it comes to the money that we're going to receive from the American Rescue Act, there's an intergenerational equity problem there, and that the money we are receiving now is going to be paid for by our children and our grandchildren and so on. And it would bother me a lot if we took that money and rather than investing it in the township that our successive generations will be using, we would use that money to continue not to raise property taxes. Now this year we're running a surplus, so we can debate whether that makes a lot of sense, but this particular slide keeps showing that black line and red line getting further and further apart. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner Courtney. Commissioner O'Neill.
Thank you very much, Chairman Zoloff, and thank you, Eric, for the presentation. I just had a question or two about the fund forecast that we just spoke about with Commissioner Courtney's questions, and I appreciate your answers. They somewhat touched on mine. My concern is looking out at the forecasting, I guess, your model or the constants you use to come out with a really precipitous drop from 23 to 24. And I'm wondering why we might not be projecting a more level forecast for that out year. Or is it simply we do have a great structure in place for conservative forecasting? But is there something more to it that you see that isn't here? Why we're practically a 2% as a forecast, and that's a little concerning. It doesn't seem consistent with years past.
Are you speaking specifically about the expenditure forecast from 2022 on?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
So
it's the page 20. It is the
yeah,
slide 22, I believe. Yeah.
Yeah. In terms of the farther we get away from 2021, by definition of doing these forecasts, the less reliable these numbers are, because they're further away from today. So what I would say is, I have to put various assumptions in for all of our major expenditure categories as we go out and go forward. I would say what the last 6 years has taught me is that generally we tend to outperform these forecasts, all other things being constant. Now, that's a positive thing, not just from, we do a little bit better, but it's also something that's really cited by the rating agencies when we go and talk with them about having a conservative forecast is seen as a general positive in terms of trying to look at your structural issues and then figure out how to best address them. So, you have about a $1.5 million increase that's projected from 22 to 23. From 23 to 24, you're about at 1.8, and then it drops back down. So honestly, off the top of my head, I can't tell you exactly why that is. Overall, you're probably increasing at about a 2 to 2.5% rate over the forecast period. But at least at this point, I would just say I wouldn't get too caught up on the 2023 and 2024. I think that would be a conversation that I would kind of elect to punt on when we get to November, when we have a little bit better information and can also make I guess I would just say more informed observations and give you a little bit better data as to what's going to happen then. The only other thing I would add is when we get out to 2023, I believe we're totally out of current labor contracts, so that's another thing that's going to be a whole new ballgame in terms of where labor contracts go. I believe the labor contracts for both of our unions go through 2022. So that's something that is a real significant cost driver that's yet to be determined for those out years.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Commissioner O'Neill. Other members of the committee have any questions or comments?
Quick couple.
President Bernheim.
Thank you very much. Eric, again, I'll echo the thanks for, putting this together so quickly. One would not know that you were 18 months rusty in anything, so it's appreciated. But a couple quick questions to see if these are thought processes that are accurate or not for future consideration. One is we have our fund balance, policy, percentage of expenses. How does that interplay with the rating agencies when they look at us, one way or the other? Is that a consideration that we need to consider ourselves in going forward?
Now, are you talking about where our fund balance levels are, or what do the rating agencies say about our fund balance policy itself?
Well, it may, or all of the
Or
above.
both, okay. So, when you read the rating agency reports, and the most recent ones are up on our website under the finance section, if you look under township debt, you will see that they speak very positively about those fund balance levels. In terms of our discussions with them, we don't speak very much about, we do talk about what our policy is. They haven't ever said anything, to my recollection, that's negative about that policy. It should be higher, it should be lower. I don't think that they would argue rating agencies are inherently extremely conservative, so they wouldn't argue for it to be lower. The trend among AAA rated municipalities is probably for it to be a little bit higher. I don't think that's an issue for us right now, especially where our fund balance is. But it's certainly something that, when I first started, maybe about 10 years ago doing this in Montgomery County, the general guidance you got was that you should have a fund balance policy between 5 and 15%, depending on your own individual circumstances of government, which was about volatility of revenue, things of that nature. That's evolved over about the last 5 years. The suggestion is that you have about 2 months of regular revenue or expenditures. So we choose to look at the expenditures because when you have an issue, what you need to pay is your expenditures. So 2 months equates to like 16.6% of overall expenditures. So within that 15 to 18 range that we're at, we're basically right on that marker. So I don't anticipate, unless guidance generally changes from some of the government finance kind of good governance organizations around fund balance, that then we would really hear anything about any concerns from the rating agencies about our policies.
Okay, so policies would be one factor, but actuality would be another, is that fair?
Yeah, they really care about what your results are, not about what your policy is. You can have a policy that you want to have 25%, but you end up with 5% every year, then they're going to say your policy is worth nothing.
All right, so then the next thing with the transfer tax, a little bit of a supply and demand. Because of the pandemic, there are less people moving, putting their homes on the market, thus those that were on the market, the prices were, in excess of asking frequently. As that eases up, one would think then there'll be more inventory and prices would come down, as would our transfer tax, and that's what we need to find out if that actually happens or not.
Yeah. So again, what we've seen really throughout the pandemic is as long as volume is there, our revenues are generally there. What impacted us the first half of last year was really the decrease in the volume. The overall average prices that we were seeing were still very positive. It's really just a volume question. So if there is more constant turnover, I've heard some people talk about there are people staying in their homes longer who might have been moving to some other type of facility, out of state, things of that nature because of COVID. If things change and then there's more volume, that could have, again, there's an interplay, because if the volume goes up enough, but the price drops just a little, if that volume is still up, you're probably still going to end up in a better position overall. It depends. If your price drops too much and your volume only drops a little, then that's when you're going to see, the overall revenue decline.
Okay. And then the business privilege tax, what was paid for 2021 is predicated upon what the particular business did in 2020.
Correct.
Right. So for 2022, it's going to depend on what happens in 2021, which still has its question mark that we need to see.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. All right. And so then here's the last thing. It's a question that I get from a number of people. In light of the fact that many folks are now working at home, and some may continue to work at home and not return to the offices, including those offices in the city. Quick disclosure, I go into town, I pay my Philadelphia city wage tax. But we have many other of our residents that are now, working at home. What, if anything, have we done or should we do to look at, whether there's any capture of business taxes that we might be entitled to?
So in terms of, if you are working from home full-time, you used to work in the city and now you have a home office, then you become an employee who is based in Lower Merion Township, you have to then pay first the local services tax, which is $1 a week tax, $52 a year. And then if you have a base of operations within the township, it depends on the type of business and how that business is set up of whether or not there is a liability related to business taxes. So if you are kind of a professional services worker and, say the company is still in Newtown Square or in Philadelphia or things, you're just working from home, it's possible there could be a very small apportionment. Usually it's a 3-factor based on property, sales and equipment, or property, sales and salary. So if there's one person from a company that's now working the township, it's likely going to be very small. But we have increased both the language over the last 2 years that we've been putting kind of in the township newsletters on these issues about business taxes, about local services taxes, about working from home, language on our websites and such. So we actually have seen a lot of people who have reached out to our office about this, mostly because in a lot of cases they are people who are working in Philadelphia, and if they really want to stop that wage tax deduction that you're paying, President Bernheim, then they want to have all their ducks in a row, and they want to have their paperwork so that they can go to their place of employment and say, stop deducting this 3.5-ish%. So we have seen a lot of new businesses. We have been registering a lot of new businesses as work from home, and we will continue to do that and continue to do any outreach that we can to hopefully promote understanding and also compliance.
Great. All right, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, President Bernheim. Other committee members with comments or questions? Eric, as President Bernheim said, what the revenue strength of business taxes in 2021 was for business performance in 2020. So therefore, business performance in 2021 will receive in 2022. We don't know if we received a windfall or the level of business activity has increased. We won't know that for some time. And so I think that's important. This township has consistently addressed the high fund balance by approving deficit budgets. That is the soundest way to reduce the fund balance, because we don't raise taxes. We reduce the fund balance by having a deficit budget, and that deficit is funded by the fund balance. And so that's in the best interest of Lower Merion taxpayers, and it's also good management of the township finances. We balance our level of debt with our general fund balance, and with the recommendations from management, we do it consistently well. And in the process, we keep taxes level and have done so for 10 years. needs to be said that our management team, particularly our manager and our CFO, their management of our finances is strong, and tonight's discussion and presentation is an example of that. So with that, I should call for public comment. Do any members of the public wish to come forward with any questions or comments? We do have some members of the public in the room. Seeing none,
Commissioner Zeloff, could I ask for just 30 seconds on one other topic?
yes, you can.
Commissioner Courtney, I was just reflecting on one of the things you said in terms of the ARP dollars and the fund balance. And I think it's a good thing for the entire board to know. One of the things that is explicit that you cannot do with ARP dollars is you cannot put them in a rainy day fund. You cannot just put them in the bank forever. It is not something, they are meant to be spent. How and what those allowable expenses are, but that's not something where we could put them in a bank, leave them there for 5 or 6 years. We would be sending them all back to the federal government. That is something that is explicit unless they change it in the interim guidance that we've received.
Eric, so it is your first time in presenting to us in 18 months. Happy to have you here, and thank you very much for being with us in person and your presentation tonight. And so with that, President Bernheim, the Finance Committee's business is concluded for this evening.
Thank you very much, and once again, Eric, thank you. That brings us to our next order of business, which is our Board of Commissioner meeting, and I will call that meeting to order and ask you all to be so kind to rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And Madam Secretary, would you be so kind as to call the roll?
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Churchill, Mr. Sinai, Mr. Stevenson, and Mr. Whalen have asked to be excused. Mr. Courtney. Here. Ms. Durbin. Here. Mr. Gabbard.
Present.
Mr. Grimes. Here. Ms. Kramer. Here. Mr. McComb. Here. Mr. McKeon. Here. Ms. O'Neill.
Here.
Mr. Zello.
Here.
Mr. Bernheim.
Present.
Mr. President, we have a quorum.
Excellent. Unfortunately, once again, I need to note the passing of some of our Lower Merion community. One is Jeffery Lincoln, who passed away on June 23. Jeffrey worked as a traffic light technician, too, in the electrical division of the Public Works Department since 2015. And Joseph Sullivan passed away on July 22. Joe was hired in 2001 as a part-time police utility attendant in the traffic safety unit in the police department. In 2007, he was promoted to a park maintenance number 1 in Park Division and in the Parks and Recreation Department. And again, our hearts and prayers go out to their families, and we thank them for their service. And I ask you to just be also kind as to rise for just a moment of silence. Thank you. So next, I need to make just a few announcements, if I may. The board did meet in executive session earlier this evening. We received reports from our professional staff regarding some litigation matters, some personnel matters, also in reference to Lower Merion School District. In addition, regarding some coronavirus issues, specifically pertaining to some questions about mask policies, which are constantly under review, and we had some discussion on 1400 Mill Creek Road. I'd also like to point out, on a higher note, that National Night Out will be held tomorrow, August 3, from 6 to 9 in the parking lot of the Wynwood Shopping Center. It's great to have that back again. If you haven't done that before, I encourage you to join. Also, as I said at the outset, the board will be in recess during the remainder of August. And Monday, September 6th, is Labor Day. That is a legal holiday. The township administration building and libraries will be closed, and there will be no refuse or recycling collection. Then, also as noted, the 2022 budget workshop will be held on Thursday, September 9 at 6 p.m. here. That brings us then to the next section of our meeting, that is public privilege of the floor. And this is an opportunity for members of the public to address the board on non-agenda items. Those are matters of public interest that are within the township's jurisdiction or authority. Do we have anybody who would be willing to do this? You need to take over.
Yes.
Hello.
All right, if you please state your name and hopefully keep your comments to about 3 minutes.
Good evening. My name is Christine Dixon Anderson, and I am here to present the 2020 annual report for the Police and Minority Relations Committee. The Police and Community Relations Committee was formed over 30 years ago in response to excessive force during a police stop of Reverend Albert G. Davis Jr.
Would you mind, I'm sorry to interrupt, would you mind getting a little closer to the microphone so we could hear you better? Thank you.
The Police and Community Relations Committee was formed over 30 years ago in response to excessive force during a police stop of Reverend Albert G. Davis Jr., who was a new pastor in Lower Merion. Community protests resulted in the establishment of a process to engage in ongoing dialogue, and under the leadership of former Superintendent Joe Daly, a group was convened to improve the relationship between the police department and the African American community of Lower Merion. Despite its longevity, the committee has never had official township status as a board, and after consultant study of Lower Merion's police and community relations, the committee was redefined as a private organization in 2018 and renamed to reflect its actual purpose as the Police and Minority Relations Committee. 2020 activity was severely limited by the COVID-19 pandemic. The goal to create a youth advisory committee was deferred. Outreach to youth was restricted as school went virtual, and the community center was closed for most of the year. The committee met on January 27th before the virus was widespread. March began the statewide shutdown, and the April 27th meeting was canceled. While we worked to set up virtual meetings in the pandemic environment, technical glitches required the committee to postpone the July 27th meeting until August 17th. The October meeting was also rescheduled for November 16th. The committee was contacted by a township resident who made cloth masks in her grandson's honor, and she requested that the Police and Minority Relations Committee distribute them to minorities in the township, which we did. The effort was named the Miles Project in honor of her grandson. The committee was advised of the Lower Merion Human Relations Commission's goals to start a student commission and to develop a community forum on race. The Police and Minority Relations Committee expressed interest in collaborating on these efforts. The annual meeting was held on November the 16th. As there were no term expirations for board officers, elections were not needed. The 2019 officers continued to serve in 2020 and include Christine Anderson, President, Robin Thomas, Vice President, and Miriam Phillips, Secretary. The PMRC may be reached at any time with the following contact information, and it's listed at the bottom of the page. I won't read it.
Thank you.
Okay. Right. Do we have anybody else for public privilege? Please come to the podium.
Rosa Cerota, Wynwood. I live at the corner of Montgomery and Worcester Road and work in my garden a lot, and I watch the cars speeding down Montgomery Avenue My husband and I were in an accident when a car in back of us propelled us into the oncoming lane on Montgomery Avenue. Fortunately, no cars were coming. So I applaud your decision to reduce the speed limit on Montgomery Avenue. I think it's going to make me feel more comfortable and hopefully many others. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Do we have anybody else who would like to step forward for public privilege? I believe we have somebody online, is that correct? All right. Mr. Guerra, you can unmute yourself and introduce yourself.
Thank you. My name is Ricky Guerra. I'm at 37 Oakland Terrace, and I'm here on behalf of the Neighborhood Club of Ballackinwood. I come to you tonight just to speak about the position statement that I believe has been circulated to all of you. And that position statement is the product of a lot of work on behalf of the Neighborhood Club. It was not a shoot from the hip kind of document. We deliberated about it at length, and we decided back in November of last year that we needed to take a position as to a 10-year redevelopment plan for the City Avenue District. After we circulated that document, we had various meetings with the township. November, February, April, and May. And throughout those 4 meetings of our steering committee, we attempted to re-examine whether a plan was needed, and if so, what it would look like. And through that deliberation, one of the things that really stuck out to us was the fact that the 10-year plan, when it was made, had a goal of 28% residential growth, 65% office growth, 7% retail growth. And when you look back at that plan 10 years later, what we got instead was 88% residential growth versus 28, which is what they were aiming for. Less than 1% office growth versus the 65% that we were, which is what we were aiming for. And 11% retail growth versus the 7%, which is what they were aiming for. And that at least told me in the Civic that at least a piece of what was instituted back in 2012 needs reexamination. It may be that the incentives that were put forth to try to build office space were not effective. It may be that some things with retail worked, and we need to encourage it more. But I think that the gist of it is that, you know, we're a township that plans. Every 10 years, we kind of pick up the book and we try to reevaluate things. And I suggest to you that now is that time. And now is the time to consider a master plan. Now, I've gotten responses to our proposal to get a master plan going. One of the, first of all, support from the neighborhood and its members, but also some criticisms. And I want to address a couple of those criticisms tonight. One of those criticisms is that it's impossible to plan for the, to make a 10-year plan for the future because we have a lot of things that are just unusual, like COVID, SEPTA, line being down, traffic. And while I agree that those things are unusual, they are not going to last forever. And I just submit to you that we don't necessarily need to wait for the perfect study scenario to begin progress on an update. We can start now. And by the time we're done, we will be able to have a scenario that will be able to reflect what a 10-year plan is going to look like. Another counterpoint that I've heard is that much of the City Avenue district is already developed. So why do we need a master plan? Here's why. There are 7 lots in City Avenue district that have not been developed that are sizable. 10 and 100 Presidential Boulevard, 27 City Avenue, 7 to 29 Bell Avenue, 225 City Avenue, the NBC offices at the corner of City Avenue and Monument, 40 Monument Road, and other places in Ballackinwood. So all of those things put together, in my estimation, are enough to warrant a study, at least a study of it. And while I understand that much of the progress has gone forth, we also understand that there's nothing you can do about those. This is not a plan that we're asking for the next year or the next 2 years. We're asking for a 10-year plan that considers everything that the district needs. And this is a district that accounts for almost half of the tax revenue in the township.
Mr. Kerr, I hate to cut anybody off ever, but we do try to limit 3 minutes. You're already double that, and we have read the report and know the issues. So if you could just try to wrap up, that'd be greatly appreciated.
Certainly.
Right. Okay, thank you.
So my ask to all of you is that you consider implementing a master plan for the City Avenue District. We ask for the study period to end by the end of the year. We ask that the township staff come up with recommendations as to whether a master plan process is needed and what those recommendations are. And we ask that it be funded. And I appreciate your time. I'm sorry for going over my time, Commissioner Bernheim, but thank all of you. I look forward to your comment.
All right, thank you very much, and I appreciate your courtesy. Do we have anybody else, Jody, for this? All right. We did receive also some written comments from Micah Sneed about shared information regarding the availability of emergency rent and utility assistance throughout Montgomery County, and those comments are publicly available, been circulated to the board. Is there any member of the board who would like to respond to any of the topics raised in public privilege? Yes, Commissioner Zella.
Thank you, President Bernheim. I want to thank Christine Dixon Anderson for the presentation to the board, which I believe occurs annually, on the excellent work of the Police Minority Relations Committee. It's remarkable that it's been in existence in this community for 30 years. There are some communities where they're just getting around to it. But we've been working on the topic and the important issue of minority relations with our police department and with the entire community for a long time. Their leadership and their committee members work hard, and they communicate. It's about communication. The police management, most police management attend the committee meetings. Many commissioners attend the committee meetings, and that makes a big difference in this community. And I think hearing from Christine Dixon Anderson and leadership of the Police Minority Relations Committee is very important for us and for the public at least once a year, so thank you.
Okay. Anybody else who would like to respond to public privilege? All right, seeing none, that takes us to the next section of our meeting, which is public comment. And this is the opportunity for members of the public to address the board on those agenda items which we have this evening. I would only exclude those that may wish to talk about the liquor license transfer. That's going to be forthcoming. There'll be a separate time to make your comments then. Do we have anybody who would like to take advantage of public comment? Seeing none, do we have anybody online, Jody, for this? Ah, yes. Mr. Bush, who was kind enough to let me know that he intended to speak. If you could put your camera on, unmute yourself.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will see what we can do about that video.
There we go. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you and the rest of the board. I'd like to address item 8A on the BNP agenda. It's 1210 Wyngate Road. It's an item that came before the Historical Commission. I think you're well aware, a replacement of an existing historical roof with solar panels. And wanted to speak briefly tonight, both in general and in specific regarding the application, because I think it's one we will begin to see more of as the interest in solar energy continues to rise across the country. And there's kind of an intersection between that technology and historic resources, and sometimes at odds. And unfortunately, I never like to appear before the board or even my own board at odds with an applicant. And unfortunately, we find ourselves at that point regarding this application. Just to give a quick background, this building, which was designed and built in the early 30s by a fairly well-known local architect, Daggett & Sons, is really a wonderful example of kind of a French chateau architecture. The original roof is a terracotta tile roof. They're fairly unusual. We have a wealth of them here in Lower Merion, which is unusual, and we're very lucky to have some of them. But in my, I think, 17 or almost 18 years on the commission, we've probably only seen 3 or 4 roofs that have been really just outstanding examples of original material and design. And this is one of those roofs that sadly it looks like we will lose. And I wanted to just shed some quick light on why it's such a unique roof. These tend to last 150 to 200 years, so they can, as we suggested to this applicant, be removed when come times for maintenance and flashing replacement, and they can be reapplied. Their longevity is such that they can withstand that. That's very unusual for any type of roofing material. And if you were to pay for that roofing material today, you'd be paying a premium. So in terms of green energy and green technology and green building, of course, preservation is the highest level of that. And to reuse a material instead of to discard it would be the antithesis of that. Luckily, it sounds like this applicant will salvage this material, which certainly is welcome and was a suggestion by the commission. But the reason that we object to the loss of it, we see the loss of existing historic roofs often. They're replaced, and we often approve those replacements. Unfortunately, this replacement is kind of on the opposite end of the scale of the original. 1, the original is still there. 2, it can still be reused. And 3, it has a texture, a color, a size, and exposure that are completely at the opposite end of the spectrum is what they'll be replaced with. So we have a textured, warm earth tone tile roof with a very small exposure, 5, 6, 7 inches, and it'll be replaced by what is a painted, smooth steel 10-inch exposure with a shingle length that's about 10 is a little exaggeration, of 5, 6, 7 times wider as well. So we talk about architectural integrity, we talk about historic character, we talk about character defining features, and this roof is one of those character defining features. It's probably one of the most important features on this existing historic resource. And so the loss of it is felt heavily at the commission because it is such an integral part of this, and the resource will suffer from the loss of that. We tried to convince the applicant that perhaps the solar could be mounted on the rear of the roof and the front of the roof left alone, the part that you see from the public right of way. And that was not an accepted alternative to the applicant, but something that we pushed for. So in summary, I wanted to give you that background. I wanted to illustrate that this is a type of application we're going to see more of in the future, I think, and why this roof in particular is so important, and why the commission fought so hard to keep at least all or part of it. I think, as one of you said in a previous meeting that I appeared at, just because you can doesn't mean you should. And a roof like this, a house like this, sometimes we can't do everything we personally would like to do with an historic resource that we own. And we have to give deference to that resource. And sadly, this is one of those times, and we're caught at cross purposes with the applicant. But I wanted to provide you with that background.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bush. Greatly appreciated. You may have captured the thought of many of us on the board as well. Is there anybody else we have for public comment? All right, thank you. Is anybody who would like to respond to public comment? Yeah, Commissioner Grimes. Oh, you know what? You are absolutely correct. Thank you. So 1 second would be so kind. Michael Pollock from Ardmore wrote in support of authorizing the advertisement of the ordinance to lower the speed on Montgomery Avenue. And Mika Sneed, also from Ardmore, wrote in support of authorizing the advertisement of the ordinance regarding Cricket Avenue. So, yes, thank you, Jody, for pointing that out. Commissioner Grimes.
Thank you, President Bernheim, and I assure you, since we're taking up the Wyngate Avenue property later, I will not say this twice, I'll say it now. I just want to thank Mr. Bush for taking the time to talk to us tonight. I think many of us always appreciate his input and the work the Historical Commission does. I think last week several of us made it clear that we are not pleased with this application, that we recognize that we are going to lose a very important part of the historic fabric of this property, but that it being a Class 2 historic resource, which only has limited protection, the most we could do is delay the removal of the historic tile for 90 days. And the recommendation that is going to be voted on tonight was to consider waiving that in exchange for the agreement of the owner to put the tile to reuse, which is somewhat of a compromise. But the other point I just want to make is what I said last week, in case some people didn't hear it. It is frustrating that we have very limited power in terms of a Class 2 resource, that we can either see if we can designate it a Class 1 with more protection, which has its own issues, or we can try and come up with another alternative which would allow us to better protect properties in cases like this. So for anyone, and I really mean members of the public, who, and the Historical Commission, who didn't hear this discussion last week, we would welcome your input as to how else we might be able to approach these to better preserve these properties. In this case, the owner is exercising their right to do what they're allowed to do. The owner is preserving the rest of the property. But the frustration is there, but I think we're doing the most we can do. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Grimes. Anybody else? All right, seeing none, then that will close that portion of our meeting. We'll move to the next section, which is our consent calendar. And that is on, well, we've got different copies of where it is. I know it's on page 4, goes through page 4 through 26 of our agenda. There are items A through M that are listed. Does anybody wish to remove any of those items from the consent calendar? Seeing none, then I will move for the approval of the consent calendar as presented. And with second, thank you, Vice President Gavin. I believe we need a roll for that.
Correct. For the adoption of the consent calendar as presented. Mr. Courtney?
Aye.
Ms. Durbin?
Yes.
Mr. Gavin?
Aye.
Mr. Grimes?
Yes.
Ms. Kramer? Mr. McComb?
Yes.
Mr. McKeon?
Yes.
Ms. O'Neill? Aye. Mr. Zelloff?
Aye.
Mr. Bernheim?
Aye.
The consent calendar is duly adopted.
Thank you. That brings us then to the next section of our meeting, and this is in reference to 1210 Wyngate Road that's found on page 27 of our agenda. And this is to consider for approval to replace an original terracotta tile roof with the Luma solar tiles and metal panels, citing Secretary of Interior Standards 2, 5, 6, and 9, subject to a 90-day delay in the issuance of a building. Such delay may be waived if the owner demonstrates to staff that reasonable efforts have been made to salvage the terracotta tile roof for use on another property. I will move for that's approval so we can start this process and some discussion. Do we have a second on that? Second. Thank you very much, Commissioner Courtney. Do we have any further discussion on this? Yes, Vice President Gavin.
Thank you, President Bernheim. Last week I objected to this and I voted against this. The board decided to move forward with it, to move forward with the recommendation. I think Commissioner Grimes was absolutely right in his comments before that the board wasn't pleased with the application as a whole, not happy with the serious loss of the historical fabric of our township, but we are limited in what we can do. And I think, as Commissioner Grimes is, I'm frustrated that we are limited in what we can do, and I hope in the future we can do more. But we're not doing all we can do. We are not asking the applicant to wait 90 days. We're not asking the applicant to think of other alternatives to use solar power. There were a couple that were brought up last time. One was, instead of taking the entire roof off and using a solar roof, one was bolting solar tiles onto the roof. That is more removable. If we allow, or if the applicant moves forward with what he's doing, this terracotta roof will never come back on. there is zero doubt in my mind that I believe the cost of this roof is in the excess of $300,000. That's not going to be taken off to put a terracotta roof back on. This is the last opportunity to save this roof. If we bolt solar panels on, they can come off, the terracotta roof can be saved. As Mr. Bush said, the panels can be on the rear of the roof, so it doesn't impact the view of this historic asset. Potentially solar panels, I don't know the property, but potentially solar panels could be placed elsewhere on the property as well. I absolutely applaud the applicant for wanting to be more sustainable, wanting to be more environmentally friendly, use solar energy. It's absolutely something we should all be doing to the extent possible, and I truly do applaud the applicant for that. But this is a truly magnificent property, and as the Historical Commission pointed out, we're going to lose with no chance of getting back this historic asset. We heard last week also that there is a garage full of terracotta tiles, and I understand that there is leaking and nobody should have to deal with a continually leaking roof. But it appears from everything we heard that there's an opportunity to fix that, to deal with that. As Mr. Bush said, the terracotta can be taken off, flashing can be fixed, anything can be fixed with the terracotta being put back on. So there's no reason that from what I've heard and that we've heard as a board, that the leaking cannot be fixed. This is something, asking for a 90-day delay so that the applicant can continue thinking about it, so more alternatives can be presented to the applicant, whether they ultimately choose to do so or not. That's something that's beyond our power. But I think to do everything we can do to maintain this historic asset would be to maintain the 90-day delay in the issuance of this. And so I'd like to, I guess, make propose an amendment to the motion, if that's all right, Mr. President. So my amendment would be essentially striking from the end of it where it says such delay. So it would continue to read, consider or approve the replacement of original terracotta tile roof with continuous solar tiles and metal panels, citing Secretary of Interior Standards 2, 5, 6, and 9, subject to a 90-day delay in the issuance of a building permit. I believe that should be. Looks like a word is missing there. Is that, I don't know. Madam Secretary, is that issuance? Sorry, so if we look at what the current motion,
it should say building permit.
Building permit. So essentially striking such delay to be waived from that point forward. So it's essentially saying we approve it subject to a 90-day delay in the issuance of a building permit, and ending it there. So that would be my amendment to the motion.
All right, so that while technically that may not fall under the classification of a quote friendly amendment, I will state this and then we're going to call a vote on that, is that when we did this last week, it bothered me then, it continued to bother me. I think you make an extraordinarily compelling argument. So while internally I may say that I would say accept that as a friendly amendment, I think we should vote on it separately. It has been moved and seconded. I don't know if there's any additional comment before we vote. Commissioner Courtney, then Commissioner Zella.
Thank you, President Burnham. After we debated this last week, I emailed Mrs. Van Boss, one of the owners of this home, to ask her for a recent PICO bill. She sent me her electric bill as well as a spreadsheet outlining their electricity costs over the last 2 years. From that, I was able to get the average monthly spend on electricity for this household. Went to PICO's website, looked at the residential rate. It's about 6.5 cents per kilowatt hour. Some quick math got me to 15,000 kilowatt hours of electricity will be consumed by this house over the course of 90 days. The EPA has a great website. It is a carbon emissions calculator, and I'm going to put it up on the screen. I plugged in 15,000 kilowatt hours of electricity. With a 90-day delay, this home and its electricity usage will produce 10.5 metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions. That is the equivalent of 2.3 cars driven on the road for a year. Or, as you can see in the second row there, consuming 1,200 gallons of gasoline. Down here at the bottom, it talks about carbon sequestration. In order to sequester the amount of carbon emissions that this home produces in 90 days, you would need to plant 176 trees and let them grow for 10 years. 13 acres of forest for a year to equal the carbon emissions produced by this home over the course of 90 days. Regardless of how we vote tonight, this roof is getting replaced. The applicant has made it very clear the alternatives that Mr. Bush proposed, that we proposed, have all been rejected. Rightly or wrongly, it doesn't matter how we vote tonight, this roof is gone. A few months ago, we adopted a resolution saying that we were going to become, thank you, we were going to become carbon neutral in this township by 2050. Tonight, we have a concrete decision. Are we going to move in the direction of carbon neutrality, or are we going to have to require ourselves to plant 176 trees? Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Commissioner Courtney. Commissioner Zella.
There are 16,000 homes in this township. We just heard the example of just one. Everything that was just said needs to be put in context. We don't know the carbon usage of the other 15,999 homes. So that's not a persuasive argument to me. Mr. Bush's arguments were very persuasive. I wish I'd heard them a week ago. A 100-year or more roof is an extremely sustainable roof, since it's that we know to be greater than the life of a roof on most of the 16,000 homes in the township. And we didn't see a photo last week of what this will look like, which is hard to believe, because if I was going to spend that much money on a historic structure, I'd want to know what it's going to look like. So I guess this is why we have two meetings. I'm changing my view and supporting Vice President Gavrin's motion, with just one final comment, is that Vice President Gavrin failed to mention that the other guy is hospitalized.
Is there anybody else who would like to address this issue? Commissioner Grimes.
Okay, thank you. So, look, I'm caught a little bit because I'm normally on the side that Vice President Gavrin so eloquently laid out. Although, and I appreciate Commissioner Courtney's position, because it is another wrinkle on this that frankly I hadn't thought about, and we probably should have thought about it. But going back, look, last week we discussed this, and people have the right, of course, to reflect and change their opinion. But as it was said, this owner, I think, made it pretty clear that he's made his decision, and he has the right to make that decision. He has investigated other alternatives, decided that's not what he wants to do, the things that we've talked about. So as was said, we are postponing the inevitable here. Maybe there's a Hail Mary, as they say, that he'll change his mind, but pretty unlikely, I would say. This was not an uneducated person who came before us last week. He also agreed to put the tile to reuse in exchange for waiving the 90 days. And, could he sell the tile or give it away anyway? Sure he could, but doesn't have an obligation if we don't pass the resolution as we put it last week. And, there's some sense that, if we put the 90 days back on there, he might not, for other reasons. So, I would just say that at least by waiving the 90 days, we got something to help the environment, to help sustainability, and promote reuse of historical artifacts, in addition to the factors that Commissioner Courtney laid out. So, while I totally sympathize with those who would change and empathize with those who would change their position, I would encourage us to stick with at least getting something out of this by sticking with the original motion. Thank you.
Okay. Commissioner Kramer.
I just wanted to remind everybody that when the applicant came here the last time, he reported having constant leaks into his house from this roof. And I don't think that it's, since it's something that he's going to do anyhow, I don't think it's fair to make him wait 3 more months and sustain more interior damage due to leaks.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Durbin.
Thank you, President Bernheim. This house is in my ward. It is not a house that's hidden away. It's in a prominent intersection. It's a magnificent property. It's a magnificent house, and people see it. Usually I'm a person who sides with the Historical Commission, and I'm very sorry to say that I don't in this case, because this property owner has done amazing things to save this house instead of raising it. And I think this is a forward-looking way of continuing to preserve this house because of the savings in energy and also the prevention of continuing leaks that they've endured. And frankly, it'd probably be better to do the roof now than to wait until it turns into the fall and winter. So I really urge all of my colleagues to recognize what the homeowners have done to preserve this magnificent property and let them go ahead and do it as they see fit, which is also absolutely in concert with our desire to save greenhouse gases and electricity and everything else. I think that they've made a considered choice, and I really don't think we should second guess them. And I do not support this amendment. I support what Commissioner Grimes set forth last week.
Commissioner Durbin, anybody? Yes, Commissioner McKeon.
Thank you, President Burnham. I support the spirit of the amendment. I don't support the amendment. Just to kind of piggyback off a little bit of what Commissioner Kramer said, this is a roof with chronic leaks, and leaks are very problematic because once water gets into a building, the water can really go anywhere, and this can compromise the interior of the building. So I think when we get to a situation with water damage, water leaks, the time is really of the essence. So that's why I think it's a great idea and concept, but I don't support the delay because I think it's more important to keep the water out of the property.
All right. Anybody else with any further comments? Well, I don't want to be redundant because I think we've all set this forth, fairly well with comments, thus far. Whether the leaks are causing some of the use of power, or whether there's other remedial measures that could be made out there. Unless we were to have somebody examine it a little bit further, we will never know, as Vice President Gavin has noted. So with that, we're going to call the vote on Vice President Gavin's amendment. So if you're voting aye, that is in favor of it. So if everybody who's in favor of the amendment would raise their hand indicating their approval. That's 1, 2, 3. Okay. Those who are not, voting no.
No.
Okay, thank you. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That doesn't add up.
6 to 4.
Oh, okay, I had 6-3, I missed one. Okay, all right, thank you very much. All right, the amendment does not pass. So then, unless there's any other further request to amend this, I will call the vote as it was originally moved and as it's set forth in our package then. All those then in favor, please raise your hand indicating your approval at that point. All right.
Aye.
That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. All right. All those opposed? 2, 3, 4. The same. It does then pass. No surprise with that vote. Mr. Bush, thank you for your information, everybody. It's a difficult call. That brings us then to the next section of our meeting, which is reference to the police committee. It regards Booth Lane. For approval, authorizing the township secretary to advertise notice of intent to adopt an ordinance to amend the code of Township of Lower Merion, Chapter 145, entitled Vehicle Traffic, Article 15, Schedule Section 145-118, Schedule 18, Parking Time Limited, by adding a 2-hour from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. except Saturday, Sunday parking limitation on the west side of Booth Lane from Old Lancaster Road to Montgomery Avenue, and by rescinding the 5-hour 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. except Saturday and Sunday parking limitation on both sides of Booth Circle for its entire length, and replacing it with a 2-hour 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. except Saturday and Sunday parking limitation. Do I have a second for that? Thank you, Vice President Gabbard. Is there any discussion regarding this? Yes, Commissioner Kramer.
I opposed this the last time, and I continue to oppose having a new restriction of this type until we have completed a policy on when we should be having parking restrictions and reviewing our existing parking restrictions in the township to make sure that they're consistent with our policy decisions. While I appreciate the concerns of neighbors who are blocked by cars parking in front of their houses, and I appreciate Commissioner Stevenson's efforts to satisfy their concerns, I don't think that that's a reason to prohibit parking on somebody's street. We should be fully utilizing our existing on-street parking instead of asking institutions or others to pave over more of our township to provide parking. That additional paving to provide parking creates more stormwater problems and also is less sustainable than using our on-street existing parking. We ought to adopt a policy that would allow restrictions on parking only when there is inadequate parking for residents, when there's a safety concern, or there's need for turnover for neighborhood businesses. We should also have a policy that encourages parking near our train stations instead of prohibiting parking near our train stations. There are many times, and none of this application, this request for a parking restriction does not meet any of the 3 criteria that I think are appropriate for a parking restriction. The fact that the neighbors want it isn't a good enough reason to put a restriction on public parking and public streets. There are many times that I've had to tell residents no to their requests, particularly for better street lighting, because the township has adopted a policy and the township staff has evaluated the issue and concluded that the particular location does not meet our criteria. There's no reason we can't have a reasonable and rational policy for parking restrictions, and no reason that our residents can't be told no once in a while if they don't meet the criteria in our policy, just as I've had to tell our residents no on other issues. So in sum, I oppose this, and I would encourage you to rethink this and also oppose it and oppose putting in new restrictions like this until we develop a full and careful policy on this issue.
Thank you. And anybody else with any other comments? Yeah, Commissioner Courtney.
Thank you, President Bernard. I just want to say I concur with Commissioner Kramer that we need a parking policy for all the reasons she stated, and also for myself. I find it hard to come down one way or the other on what should happen here, and in a situation like that, I think it would be nice for us as commissioners to be able to refer back to a stated policy or to have our zoning code address what happens when educational institutions have concerns like this with the neighborhood in terms of parking during events or during daily use overflowing into the neighborhood. However, I do not concur with Commissioner Kramer in terms of opposing this evening. In absence of policy, I will defer to the ward commissioners. I believe this borders Commissioner Zeloff and Commissioner Stevenson's ward, and last week both were in favor.
Thank you. Anybody else with any further comments? I'm just going to add then before we call the vote, we're not doing this in a vacuum, and we have discussed, issues of policy and was referenced by our superintendent of police. There are criteria that are looked at each and every time, and as the phraseology was just used by Commissioner Kramer, by particular locations are looked at on a case-by-case analysis. And just to use the example of saying, encourage parking by train stations. Each of the train stations are different in their community. So while we can have clarified some of those standards that the police look at so that it becomes more clear for us when we make a vote, as indicated by Commissioner Courtney, this is, as I said, not being done in a vacuum. So with that then, unless there's any further questions or comments, we can call the vote. Oh, Anna, I'm sorry. Commissioner Durbin, my apologies.
Yeah, I just want to say briefly, I support the idea of having a policy, and
in this particular case, it's not done for a public safety reason. So I think until we have a policy, we should stop doing these piecemeal things that just cause one street to get its way and then it flows into another street where the residents are also unhappy. Thank you.
All right, thank you for that. Any other questions or comments? All right, seeing none, we will then call the vote. All those who are in favor, please raise your hand and indicate your approval. Say aye. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I count 8. Those who are opposed? 1, 2, 8, 2. All right, okay. It therefore does pass. But as indicated at our last meeting, we will have those standards or policy, whatever, that do exist and were presented before the board, so that we can look at that and review that once again. That brings us then to our next section, which is for a public hearing for the adoption of the resolution of a liquor license transfer on 24 Cricket Avenue. You'd find this on page 29 of our agenda. It is to consider for adoption a resolution approving the transfer of restaurant liquor license number R19354 into Lower Merion Township from Upper Merion Township to a restaurant to be located at 1 Ardmore Place, that's 34 Cricket Avenue, by Broad and Bistro Ardmore LLC, subject to the representations made and set forth at the public hearing on this matter, and subject to approval by the Pennsylvania Liquor Control Board. So we will officially open the hearing, and I believe our township manager will be able to explain something about this to us.
Yes, Commissioner Bernheim. The process is that where a municipality has more liquor licenses than 1 per 3,000, that in that case, the only way to get a new liquor license allocated in the township is to transfer one from another portion of the county into the municipality. In order for that to happen, there has to be a public hearing held by the local governing agency, and the applicant needs a resolution to take with them to the Pennsylvania Liquor Control Board in order to be able to transfer that license to Lower Merion. Obviously, Lower Merion has way more than 1 liquor license per 3,000 population. We have at this point 46 restaurant licenses alone, and that doesn't count the club and a few other special licenses like brew pubs. So that's why we're here in this process here tonight. The applicant, Board and Bistro Ardmore LLC, proposes to operate a restaurant and bar that would feature a variety of board and table games. I believe the applicant is with us here tonight and could be available to answer any questions. Your solicitor has prepared a resolution that was attached to your packet that would basically approve the liquor license transfer if you're so inclined. You also have in your packet a pretty good description of what the operation would be at this location, as well as the menu and a sort of proposed layout of the space. This would go into the currently vacant space at 1 Ardmore Place on the ground level. So it really would be, at this point, the first to locate in that vacant space. But I'm free to answer any questions, and again, as I said, the applicant is here tonight.
First, are there any questions for anyone for our township manager? Okay, Commissioner McComb, please.
Does the applicant have any history of any violations in other establishments, other health code violations, or other establishments they may own or operate that have a liquor license? And I would be interested in what their track record has been today.
Good question for the applicant.
Okay.
Okay, so hold that thought for one moment, just 1 second if you'd be so kind. Anybody else with any other questions for our township manager?
Since this is a public hearing, you're really supposed to get the public's input and then have the board do their thing after you close the public hearing.
I understand that completely. However, bear with me if I may. I'm going to allow the applicant, so the public then has questions after the applicant speaks, they will have that opportunity by what they state. So, sir, if you want to come up and introduce yourself.
Did you hear my question? I mean,
I did, absolutely.
All right, first, could you introduce yourself? Tell us who you are, please. Thank you.
President. Yes, so I'm Matt Hendricks. I'm the owner of Board and Bistro. I also own a board game cafe in Philadelphia, which opened in October of 2018, which we also have an R license at. So there have been no health code violations. There have been no liquor license violations or anything like that. Okay. To answer your question. Thank you.
Is there anybody who has any other questions for the applicant on here? Yes, Commissioner Courtney.
Thank you, President. First off, thank you for meeting with the Ardmore Progressive and North Ardmore Civic Associations last week. I got to listen in on that. I was wondering if you could repeat some of what you said with regard to the atmosphere, families welcome or adults only.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner Courtney. I really appreciate the opportunity. So the background, and I will keep this brief, and I expect to hear beeping if I don't, but my wife and I, for our 10th wedding anniversary, went up to Toronto, where the first board game cafe in North America was started, and just had a really nice time there. And usually my wife, who's here with me tonight, does not like to go into game stores because they're pretty surly, but it was a great time. We just sat around, had coffee, played board games, and so a few years ago when we started to look at, okay, what kind of business would we want to get into, we thought about, hey, could a board game cafe work in Philadelphia? And so in October of 2018, we opened Thirsty Dice, Philly's first board game cafe. We've had a lot of success. We've thankfully weathered the pandemic so far, which has been good, but we've also learned a lot of things, and so Board and Bistro really represents the next iteration of that, to take a lot of the things that we've learned at our first location in Philadelphia and bring it here to Ardmore, where we know a lot of our patrons come in because we get data from Google Maps in terms of who's asking for directions and these sorts of things. So we're really excited about coming here to Ardmore. Thank you.
Thank you. Anything else for the applicant while he's here? All right.
Yeah, sure. Question, sir. You said in Philadelphia you've had no violations at all?
I've had no liquor license violations.
Oh, liquor license violations.
The health violations, we had like a cleaner in the kitchen at one point. I think it was in January of 2019. We had a cleaner in the kitchen.
Yeah, I've actually looked. You're correct that you've had no serious violations. I think we could agree that pretty much every food establishment has something, as scary as that is to think about. But I just wanted to make sure, because it's a matter of credibility, yeah, yeah.
So the citations we had were, I think, corrected on site is the format that they take.
Yeah, I think, yes. You have a very good record, but I just wanted to clarify that. Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else for the applicant? No, sir, thank you very much. All right, now, whether there is any public comment or questions? See none. Do we have anybody online? No, we did, I received one written comment, again, from Lake Sneed, in support of the liquor license. With that, then we can, and you can sit down, but thank you, sir. With that, we can then close the public hearing, and I will move for the adoption of the resolution. We have a second. Oh, you'll get a chance to speak.
Got it.
Okay. Second, thank you, Commissioner Courtney. Yep. All right, so it has been moved and seconded. Now would be the time if anybody wanted to make any comments, such as Commissioner Zeloff.
Thank you, President Bernheim. This approval of a liquor license is a big step to bring one in from outside of the township. We have many in our township, as our manager reported. And I want to just, in my view, this is to proceed, is not establishing a precedent that this board, whether tonight or any other time, can say no to the transfer of a liquor license. I think it should be handled on a case-by-case basis. It depends on the location and the community. Hearing no community opposition and hearing the explanation and track record of the applicant, I do not oppose this transfer, but I think it's important to state that that may not always be the case. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Zeloff. Commissioner Courtney.
Thank you, President Bernheim. I love board games. Most of my family won't play Monopoly with me anymore due to past transgressions. But I am very excited to have this place come to Ardmore in a retail space that, hey, we have yet to fill since it came online. I think it'll be a great addition to the community. I like the idea that there are venues where my entire family can come and enjoy themselves, and my wife and I can set an example of how a responsible adult can enjoy themselves while playing board games and having fun and maybe even having a drink. So I think this is a great idea. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Commissioner Courtney, and I did note those extra deeds of Boardwalk and Park Place in your pocket. Yes. Vice President Gafford.
Thank you, President Bernheim. Just one quick comment to the applicant. If you could find a friend for Commissioner Courtney, we would all be very happy so he would have somebody to play with. Thank you.
Okay, this seems like we're in the mood for calling a vote on a liquor license. So, is there any other comment or discussion? All right. Seeing none, I believe we need a roll call vote. Is that correct?
No, actually, it's just a resolution.
Okay, indeed, you're correct. Okay, then all those in favor, please raise your hand and indicate your approval of aye.
Aye.
All right. All right. Any opposed? Seeing none, it therefore does indeed carry, and thank you all very much, and we look forward to visiting your establishment. All right, that then brings us close to our close. Is there anybody with any unfinished or new business that they would like to present to the board before we begin our summer break? Seeing none, I almost feel compelled to say see you in September, or
Don't sing it.
Yep, I won't sing it, all right, okay, but I'm glad someone knows the song. So I thank you all for your hard work this evening. I hope you enjoy your summer break and have a good evening. We are hereby adjourned.
Good night, all.